The viewership for Loki on Disney Plus is down by a third since season 1, and pre-sales for the Marvels are now behind what they were for Black Adam and The Flash at this point in their release cycles, indicating that Disney, Bob Iger and Kevin Feige all better brace themselves for impact. That fits right in with the newfound acceptance that Marvel is indeed in crisis, something Hollywood could only admit after Variety spelled it out for them. But what not even Variety could bring themselves to admit though, is the answer to exactly why Marvel is in a crisis. Oh, they gave an acceptable excuse that doesn't hold up to scrutiny, mind you, but not the real answer, as that would go directly up against one of Hollywood's most sacred of cows. Intuitively, we all know how the answer manifests itself on screen.
Put a chick in it, make her gay!
My name is Carol.
Put a diverse woman in it, make it gay!
But that's merely the on-screen manifestation. What were the behind-the-scenes machinations that led to this? At what point did the once unstoppable juggernaut begin to veer off the rails? For there was indeed one fateful point where that happened, and however much the authors try to downplay and even obfuscate it, it is indeed revealed between the pages of the book MCU: The Reign of Marvel Studios by Joanna Robinson and others. In this editorial, I will break down what the entertainment media complex is so deathly afraid of pointing out, namely the moment it all went wrong for the MCU. To fully appreciate the significance of that moment, we will begin with the excuse Hollywood is trying to comfort itself with, before looking at Marvel's secret sauce and when they decided to scrap it, because that's what they did, and the MCU never recovered. To comfort themselves, Hollywood has decreed that the problems with the MCU is really that Kevin Feige was stretched too thin between the movies and Disney Plus shows. Even Variety writes, the source of Marvel's current troubles can be traced back to 2020. That's when the COVID pandemic ushered in a mandate to help boost Disney's stock price with an endless torrent of interconnected Marvel content for the studio's fledgling streaming platform Disney Plus. According to the plan, there would never be a lapse in superhero fare, with either a film in theaters or a new television series streaming at any given moment. Note that this is a tacit dig at Bob Chapek, who was the CEO at the time, but it bears reminding that all the crap that would come out on Disney Plus was already in production, having been greenlit by Kevin Feige under Bob Iger. Variety continues, but the ensuing tsunami of spandex proved to be too much of a good thing, and the demands of churning out so much programming taxed the Marvel apparatus. Moreover, the need to tease out an interwoven storyline over so many disparate shows, movies and platforms created a muddled narrative that baffled viewers. And they'll say that with a straight face, while ignoring that the majority of all that content was about replacing fan-favorite characters with diverse and/or female counterparts, while not a single character introduced in Phase 4 or Phase 5 has resonated with the majority of the audience. Not a single one. Keep in mind, from Iron Man to Ant-Man, the majority of the Avengers roster was largely unknown to the moviegoing audience at the time of their debut, and yet they were instantly embraced. Somewhere along the way, that stopped, which suggests issues run deeper than Kevin Feige being spread too thin. The one mainstream source that comes the closest to describing where the fall of the MCU truly began is MCU: The Reign of Marvel Studios. Even though it is a highly partisan puff piece which tries to conceal it, the answer is there. It correctly described the rise of the MCU, which we covered in our previous video. If you haven't seen it yet, I would recommend doing so, because what we're about to cover builds on that. But before we explore the fateful moment that led to the fall of the MCU, let's take another moment to explore the secret of Marvel's success. Following the success of Iron Man, the authors expressed the editorial view that Kevin Feige had proven his worth as president of production, and that he didn't need anyone looking over his shoulder. But instead, the evil money pincher Ike Perlmutter proved to be an obstacle. Yes, that is how the book describes him, in those exact words, an obstacle to Kevin Feige. In being an obstacle, Ike Perlmutter established the Marvel Creative Committee, which would have oversight over Kevin Feige. This was a horrible thing to have happened, according to the editorial opinion of the book. But if you think about it for a second, it makes perfect sense. Yes, Iron Man was a smash hit, but its production was also a complete and total shambles, as was well documented in this very book. The one who must bear most of the responsibility for that was the president of production, Kevin Feige. That Jon Favreau was able to conjure a great movie out of all the chaos production had been is a testament to his skill as a filmmaker more than anything else. So to Ike Perlmutter, the one who ultimately paid the bills and who personally stood to lose if it didn't work out. The true lesson from Iron Man would have been, we got away with it this time, but let's not try that again. Some structure is needed here, and so that's what he did, by establishing the Marvel Creative Committee. The Marvel Creative Committee had two overriding responsibilities. First, to ensure the movies were toyetic, a lesson Avi Arad had imparted on Ike Perlmutter long before his exit from Marvel, during the years they ran Toy Biz together. The rationale behind this was simple: if the characters were cool enough to sell toys to young boys and adult collectors alike, they would also appeal to the rest of the males in the general moviegoing audience. Because remember, Marvel was a male-driven brand. The second responsibility of the Marvel Creative Committee was ensuring the movies would be interconnected and good. As Batman and Robin had demonstrated, it doesn't help how toyetic it is if the movie doesn't cut it. Illustrating this point, this very book even relays the story that upon learning of the 1994 Fantastic Four, shortly after beginning their Marvel adventure, Arad and Perlmutter bought that movie from the filmmakers and buried it, specifically so it wouldn't harm the Marvel brand. So these then were the mandates of the Marvel Creative Committee. Oversee Kevin Feige to ensure that the movies he oversaw production of ended up toyetic, so they'd sell lots of toys to the male target audience, ensure they were interconnected, and most importantly, ensure they were good. The editorial opinion of the authors of the book is that the Marvel Creative Committee did no good and were a useless shackle on Feige from day one, but by all outwardly accounts, the Marvel Creative Committee were instrumental to the rise of the MCU. The book, which is far from a neutral source, only cites two examples of where the Marvel Creative Committee clearly made movies better, namely two notoriously troubled projects, Thor: The Dark World and Ant-Man, where it was the Creative Committee that decided that Loki initially had been underutilized, so his scenes had to be expanded and redone, and it was they that demanded the larger S.H.I.E.L.D. presence and Avengers integrations in Ant-Man. Beyond that, the book doesn't list any direct interventions, which doesn't mean they didn't happen, only that the authors decided not to include them. What we do know though, is that for the duration of Phase 1 and Phase 2, all the MCU movies stuck to the mandates of the Marvel Creative Committee. The movies went from strength to strength, the toys flew off the shelves to the delight of both Marvel and their licensing partners, and gradually, Marvel movies became synonymous with event movies, worldwide. Despite explicitly being made as toyetic in order to appeal to a male audience, the resulting movies appealed to girls and boys, women and men, across language and cultural barriers. However critical the authors are of it, the Marvel Creative Committee must have done something right. Which is not to say they didn't go too far in some places, and it was in addressing those that disaster struck. Marvel was a male brand, which Ike Perlmutter and Avi Arad brought to ever new heights by retooling for the boys' toy market. Going by traditional rules of thumb from that market, that meant for the longest of time, black characters and female characters like Black Widow and Gamora got shafted, even in toy shelves, let alone for any possible standalone movies. And this irked Kevin Feige something fierce, and I single out Gamora and Black Widow because they were established on screen and there was a verifiable demand for them in the toy shelves, which had not adequately been served. Years earlier, Ike Perlmutter only agreed to sell Marvel to Disney under the condition that they back off and leave the running of Marvel to him, which Bob Iger had agreed to do, right up until the deal was done and he changed his mind. He did so in 2015. That's when Kevin Feige approached Bob Iger and informed him of his frustrations with Ike Perlmutter and the Marvel Creative Committee. In retrospect, what Bob Iger should have done was remind Feige that if he really wanted something and was able to convince Perlmutter why it was a good idea, Perlmutter tended to yield in the end. Case in point, Perlmutter had been against hiring Robert Downey Jr. for Iron Man in the first place because of his baggage, but yielded when he saw evidence it would work. He had also been against hiring him back for Captain America Civil War, but yielded again when Feige argued why it had to be so. He had even fought against movies led by black and female characters, but yielded there too, as both Black Panther and Captain Marvel had been greenlit the year before. Perlmutter and the Marvel Creative Committee had in fact given Feige plenty of victories, he just had to fight hard for them, as well as incorporating their notes, which often made the movies better. Though that certainly would have been annoying if Feige thought they were good enough already. Either way, what Iger should have done was remind Feige that as frustrating as it may be in the middle of it, by the end of the day, Feige, Perlmutter and the Creative Committee hashing it out had led to the MCU becoming an, at the time, unstoppable juggernaut. What Iger did instead is what sent Marvel and the MCU towards the path of destruction. I've already established that the book goes out of its way to obfuscate the real reason for the fall of the MCU, even to the point of rewriting the official timeline for the MCU, which is presented in the beginning of the book. Let's now explore how. The timeline reads, August 31st of 2015. Kevin Feige no longer reports to Ike Perlmutter. That is an extreme sanitization of what actually happened, namely the disbandment of the Marvel Creative Committee. Alongside it, any semblance of checks and balances were also removed. That's what this paragraph should say, because that's what happened. You need checks and balances, as annoying as they may be, and both Kevin Feige and the authors of this book certainly thought that they were, and they wouldn't be the first. George Lucas famously complained about all the compromises he had to make during the making of the original trilogy, and so the big selling point for the prequel trilogy was that this was George Lucas unbound, unshackled by the petty minds of everyone else who held him in check during the original trilogy. As it turned out though, those who held him in check had been right all along. So too it was with Marvel and the MCU. It went from strength to strength as long as there was a control mechanism there to keep Kevin Feige and therefore the MCU on purpose and on mission. With the removal of the Marvel Creative Committee, there was no longer a system in place to ensure that the movies would be toyetic or appeal to a male demographic. There was no system in place to ensure the movies would be interconnected or that they would be any good. Those notes and feedback from the Creative Committee that actually had made the movies better before would no longer be forthcoming. Everything was now contingent on the whims of Kevin Feige, who was promoted to the head of Marvel Studios, reporting directly to Alan Horn. In the aftermath of this, hit pieces started appearing in the genre trades, describing Perlmutter and the Creative Committee as obstacles and roadblocks, celebrating that the MCU now would be bolder. But what really had happened was that the stage had been set for the MCU to veer off course. The more perceptive of you may have noticed that the Marvel Creative Committee was disbanded in the fall of 2015, but the MCU still had many good projects left in it by then. The reason for that is simple. Before being disbanded, the Marvel Creative Committee had already exerted their influence on most of the to-be-released Phase 3 movies, with the exception of Black Panther and Captain Marvel. It was from Phase 4 onwards that the MCU would truly be the vision of an unshackled Kevin Feige. Like Jon Favreau had done with Iron Man, director Ryan Coogler was the one who made magic happen on Black Panther, a movie which came at just the right time to catch the cultural zeitgeist. And so it was Captain Marvel that was patient zero for Kevin Feige's MCU, or as Nerdrotic would come to call it before the rest of the world caught on, the MCU. The obvious choices for a female-driven Marvel movie would have been Black Widow or Gamora, established characters with a fanbase whose toys there was demand for. Yet, Kevin Feige went with Captain Marvel instead, a largely unknown character that had never been any demand for in the toy aisles and who had never been able to sustain even a comic book run for any length of time. Even the Guardians of the Galaxy, as unknown as they were to the general public, had achieved that. Victoria Alonso, head of visual effects and LGBTQIA+ activist with every fiber of her being, whom Kevin Feige had just promoted to his second-in-command, may have had something to do with the decision to go with Captain Marvel. Either way, in a meeting between Kevin Feige and the writer of the comic book run they were going after, Kelly Sue DeConnick, whom you all know from this clip.
And if you don't like my politics, don't buy my book.
Feige asked her, how is Captain Marvel any different from Captain America? To which DeConnick answered, not in those exact words, but what nonetheless amounted to, Captain Marvel is an entitled man-hating bitch with a giant chip on her shoulder. And that's the movie they proceeded to make. If the Marvel Creative Committee still had been there, they would never have stood for a movie with such a villainous and unlikable lead. But now, it was Kevin Feige that called all the shots. Because of it being released in between Avengers movies, and with reports of many sold out but empty screenings in mind, it went on to gross more than $1 billion, but it got a new kind of negative feedback that Marvel hadn't seen before, in person, online, and on YouTube. The editorial opinion of the book, written by Joanna Robinson and others, this is her right here.
And if you don't like my politics, don't buy my book.
No, that was Kelly Sue DeConnick. Here is what the author of this book, Joanna Robinson, looks like. Oh, come on, Tom, be serious.
Sorry.
Yeah, there we go. That's Joanna Robinson, and the editorial opinion of her book reads: The internet mob was correct that Larson wanted to change the status quo, which only made its members more determined to shout her down with negative reviews, online abuse, and YouTube videos accusing the actress of ruining the MCU. And those videos were quite right, weren't they? Even if they didn't know the vagaries of Marvel Entertainment's corporate politics, they were siding with Ike Perlmutter and the defunct Creative Committee, who had lost the long war to keep Marvel Studios focused on male and white characters. But that's where she's wrong, and where this book proves that it's so slanted it has to be read with a slant in mind. The audience didn't unwittingly side with Perlmutter. It was Perlmutter and the Marvel Creative Committee who understood the audience. That is something an unshackled Kevin Feige, spurred on by Victoria Alonso and enabled by Bob Iger, simply did not do. For further evidence of this, just look at the toy sales. After the complete takeover by Kevin Feige and Victoria Alonso, the book never mentions toy sales again, and that would be because they cratered. The highly slanted editorial opinion of the book continues. Marvel Studios, under Feige and Alonso and other leaders, recognized that its audience was the hundreds of millions of people, almost half of them women, who loved the MCU. What they failed to recognize, though, was that all of those hundreds of millions of people across the world, languages and cultures, of which nearly half were women, loved the MCU as it was when Kevin Feige had been kept in check by Ike Perlmutter and the Marvel Creative Committee. By making the movies toyetic and appealing to boys and men, interconnected and good, they had in fact made movies that appealed to everyone, everywhere. In their misguided attempt at widening the appeal beyond their existing audience, which was everyone, they began focusing on diversity, equity, and inclusion, all while antagonizing the built-in audience whose more vocal members they dismissed as a small but vocal coterie of cranks and trolls who campaigned against MCU movies with prominent female characters like Eternals and Black Widow as representing the decline of Marvel and the rise of the MCU, which they totally did. The Black Widow movie came out years too late. The studio made movies starring women and people of color with increasing frequency, and in the 2022 TV show She-Hulk Attorney at Law, Marvel even had the hero, Jen Walters, battle her male online critics. Or put in more audiovisual terms, in their attempt to appeal to the women who already were watching, they decided to adopt the Kathleen Kennedy School of Filmmaking that had worked oh so well for Star Wars.
Put a chick in it, make her gay!
Put a diverse woman in it, make it tame.
But Mrs. Kennedy, Bambi's a baby deer.
Fuck baby deer, put a chick in it, make her gay! Excuse me, I believe I asked you to put a chick in this and make her gay. Then you'd better put a chick in it and make it fucking gay as fuck.
I love that meme. It so perfectly encapsulates and satirizes everything wrong with modern pop culture while sticking it to those responsible for it. And for that reason it must be seen and shared, which is why we use these clips so much. And now so can you, because we made this awesome tea inspired by it. Use the power of satire to take back our culture and get yours now from our mixed tea store. Link is in the description. But that little plug aside, and so no one gets carried away, let's take a moment to emphasize that the problem isn't the women per se, but rather how lame they are, i.e. their characterization. One of the things the Marvel Creative Committee also used to serve as quality control for was that the characters were likable and relatable. Even if Tony Stark was a rich white man and the embodiment of the patriarchy, he was flawed and seeking to redeem himself, and so audiences of both genders from every ethnicity and every class around the world related to him at that level and wanted to see him succeed. But with that check and balance removed, the new and more diverse characters were defined by little more than their immutable characteristics. On the whole, there was nothing more to them beyond the chip on their shoulder for which the established characters and the audience had to bear the brunt.
Well, here's the thing, Bruce. I'm great at controlling my anger. I do it all the time. But when I'm catcalled in the street, when incompetent men explain my own area of expertise to me, I do it pretty much every day, because if I don't, I will get called emotional or difficult, or I might just literally get murdered. So I'm an expert at controlling my anger because I do it infinitely more than you. So all of this just feels like projecting a lot of shit onto me.
As is always the case, their efforts at making the MCU more inclusive had in reality made it exclusionary. Even the female audience fled. This wasn't the MCU they signed up for. For all girl power all the time, they preferred innate female properties, like Barbie. Now that the entertainment media complex has finally caught up with us YouTubers and admitted that the MCU is indeed in crisis, the floodgate of horror stories, from Blade to Daredevil, has opened, and we'll be exploring many of them in videos to come. What they have been afraid to point out though is what we just did. The precise moment the MCU went off the rails and why it did. In their quest for diversity, equity, and inclusion, Kevin Feige, Victoria Alonso, and Bob Iger killed the single greatest entertainment franchise there ever was. They snapped away a bigger percentage of the audience than Thanos did the population of the universe. And that's not even joking. By even the most generous of metrics, 60% of the audience is gone. Other things compounded it, like Bob Iger's demand for non-stop Marvel content on Disney+, something which did stretch Feige so thin that he relied on Victoria Alonso for day-to-day production oversight even more. But fundamentally, it was the removal of the checks and balances held in place by Ike Perlmutter's Marvel Creative Committee that marks the spot where everything went wrong. Now, it only remains to be seen how badly the Marvels is going to flop. Let me know your thoughts on all of this in the comments. And before you go, head on over to our mixed tea store and get your awesome new tea which encapsulates and satirizes everything wrong with modern pop culture. Not only does it have the coolest design around, it is super comfortable as it's made of high quality pre-shrunk 100% cotton. And it comes in men's and women's models and as a hoodie. Use the power of satire to take back our culture and get yours from our mixed tea store. Link is in the description.